The ghosts of Hillside Psychiatric Hospital. In the small town of Asheville, Maine, on the outskirts where dense forests hide old secrets, stood the abandoned Hillside Psychiatric Hospital. It had been closed nearly half a century ago after a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances. Locals shunned the place, and children frightened each other with stories of the ghosts of Hillside. But the real truth about the hospital turned out to be much scarier. Sarah, a local college student, had always been interested in the paranormal. She kept a small blog where she talked about ghost stories. Her subscribers asked for a report on Hillside, so Sarah decided to go there with two friends, Jack and Lisa. They grabbed a camera, flashlights, and a voice recorder to record anything strange. The path to the hospital was through an overgrown road. Old trees stood like grim sentinels and their branches creaked in the wind. As Sarah and her friends got closer, they saw the building. The hospital looked like a nightmare come to life. Chipped paint, broken windows, and graffiti-covered walls. Should we go back? Lisa suggested hesitantly, feeling inexplicably pressured. We're just getting started, Sarah replied, turning on the camera. They entered the building. Inside it smelled rotten and damp. The floor was strewn with glass shards and garbage. Nothing strange happened at first. They skimmed the hallways, empty wards, and treatment rooms. However, the further they went deeper, the stronger the feeling became that someone was watching them. Did you hear that? Jack asked suddenly, stopping. Everyone froze. From far away came a soft cry, almost childlike. It could be the wind, Sarah said, but her voice shook. As they walked deeper into the building, the crying grew louder. They approached a room with a peeling sign that read number 13. Lisa opened the door with trembling hands, but it was empty inside. However, the voice recorder left on the threshold recorded a voice. You're here too. By morning, they found that their flashlights began to run out of power faster than usual. The camera also began to work intermittently, even though the battery was fully charged. The walls of the hospital began to come alive. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and not in time with their movements. On the second floor, they found an old room with patient records. Among the yellowed folders, one contained a special story. Patient number 27, a woman named Margaret Hart, claimed to hear the voices of the dead. She had been attempted to be treated with shock therapy, but had died under strange circumstances. Rumor has it that she warned doctors that if they didn't stop the experiments, the hospital would become a prison for souls. As night fell, the situation became more heated. Sarah noticed that Lisa began to behave strangely. She stopped every now and then, as if listening to something invisible. You can hear them, can't you? Lisa whispered softly. Who them? Sarah was frightened. Lisa pointed to an empty hallway. But when Sarah looked that way, she saw that the corridor was no longer empty. There were figures standing there, covered in a sort of gray mist. They didn't move, but their empty eye sockets stared straight at her. At dawn, when the group decided to leave the hospital, the exit was blocked. The door through which they had entered was shut tight, as if it had never existed. Panic overwhelmed them. This place won't let us go, Jack shouted. Lisa stopped suddenly and said in a low voice that was clearly not her own, You came here to find us. Stay. Sarah grabbed Jack's arm in terror and they ran away, leaving their belongings behind. Lisa didn't follow them. Soon her screams stopped. 3 days later, rescuers found only Sarah and Jack wandering through the woods in a state of utter exhaustion. They could not explain what had happened. However, reviewing the footage, the police found faces on the video. They were contorted with terror and anger. Hillside Hospital remained abandoned. Those who tried to unravel its mysteries disappeared, and the voices inside whispered that new seekers would soon be found. Sarah and Jack returned home, but they couldn't forget this place. Even weeks after their escape from Hillside, they felt the gaze of unseen forces upon them. At night, they had nightmares about those they had left behind and what had happened to Lisa. One day, while going through old tapes, Sarah discovered something strange. In one of the videos from the last night, her own voice, which she couldn't remember, said something before leaving Ward 13. They'll never leave. Sarah froze, unable to believe what she had just heard. Her voice sounded foreign, as if she wasn't saying it herself, but someone else was saying it for her. "Are you sure you heard that?" she asked Jack, who sat languidly on the couch. He nodded, but his eyes were tired, full of terror. "Those words, they weren't just whispers. They made me feel as if we'd left something out there that was now looking for us." A few more weeks passed, and Jack began to lose his peace again. He saw more and more often in his nightmares the faces of the Hillside patients, their contorted bodies reaching for him like hands out of the fog. He began to avoid even open doors and windows, sensing that something invisible was watching him. "We have to go back," he once said to Sarah. "We have to find out what happened there." Sarah looked at him, and her heart squeezed. She knew it would be dangerous, but even more she realized their connection to this place was not over. There was a restless fear in her soul, as there was in Jack's, that compelled her to return, as if some invisible force was drawing them to Hillside. In the evening they were again on the old abandoned road that led to the hospital. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He kept looking around, listening for every rustle. When they reached Hillside, everything looked the same as it had the first time. Grim walls, broken windows, moss-covered doors. But this time something was truly wrong. They passed through the main entrance and found themselves in a corridor that had once seemed empty and lifeless. Now it was filled with a heavy, viscous air, as if something ancient and sinister had soaked the walls. In places there were traces of dark spots that seemed to move across the floor, following them. "We're not alone," Jack said quietly as they reached the stairs leading to the second floor. Suddenly there was an eerie, inhuman laughter that echoed off the walls. The camera, which they had turned back on, began to shake as if someone was jerking it from inside. The flashlight in Sarah's hands went out, and figures appeared in the darkness, faintly visible, indistinct, like smoke. With each step they became more and more distinct, but they weren't people. They were shadows, living but without form. "Run!" Jack shouted, grabbing her arm, but his voice was weak, as if it came from somewhere far away. But it was too late. They found themselves in the very corridor that had led them to Ward 13. With every step they took, the shadows grew brighter, and the sounds coming from there grew louder. When they entered the room, the door slammed shut behind them. Inside, everything was the same as before, but with each passing moment, the atmosphere changed. The ceiling began to crack, the walls began to fall as if closing around them. New inscriptions began to appear on the mold-covered walls, texts that had once been written by patients, but they were changing, merging into something unified. "We are here forever." In the midst of this nightmare, Sarah heard a familiar voice. "Lisa." She stood in the corner of the room, her eyes as empty as abysses. She was whispering something unintelligible, but every word sounded like a spell. "Lisa!" shouted Sarah, coming closer. Lisa turned around. Her face was mottled, her skin flabby and covered in sores. She looked directly at Sarah and her voice came through again, but now it was full of terror and pain. "You will all stay here like I did. We're all there's now. They took me. Now they will take you." Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet disappear and she lost consciousness. When Sarah woke up, she was lying on the cold, damp floor of the ward. It was still as dark and cold around her as before, but now the space seemed cramped and confined, as if the walls, ceiling and floor had shrunk around her. Jack was beside her, looking in her direction, but his gaze was as blank as Lisa's. "Jack?" Sarah whispered, but his eyes were unresponsive. He stood like a statue, his body lifeless and stony. Suddenly she noticed deep red lines running down his neck, as if something was digging into his skin. She jumped up, trying to pull him away, but his hands became slippery and cold as a dead man. At that moment, she heard a thin, almost indistinguishable sound. The very voices. "Did you hear it? Did you hear us? We're all here. We're all." Sarah turned toward the source of those words. Among the dark corners of the room, where nothing had been before, silhouettes now began to appear. And at that moment, one of them stepped forward. He was tall, with a distorted face covered in scars. His eyes were closed, as if he were blind, but Sarah felt he could see her. "You all are here," the silhouette said, and his words echoed in her mind, as if the very air around her had become alive. Sarah felt something invisible squeezing her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. A multitude of shadows reaching out to her like arms wrapped around her, squeezing her until she was in pain. She tried to scream, but the sound stuck in her throat. "You're back. You won't leave," one of them whispered. At that moment, Sarah realized that they were all here, all these souls trapped within the walls of the hospital. This place didn't just leave traces in their memories, it took the souls of those who dared to disturb its peace. All the patients, all those unfortunate people who had been tortured and experimented on, were now part of this place. And now Sarah and Jack were among them. But where was Lisa? Sarah noticed that her shadow had not disappeared from the corner of the room. Lisa was standing, her body twisted as if she had lost her shape, but her eyes were still full of pain and fear. "Lisa!" Sarah took a step forward, but suddenly felt her feet sinking into some viscous substance, and she couldn't move anymore. Lisa, without saying a word, turned and walked towards the door, which suddenly opened by itself. Sarah tried to get up, but her body wouldn't listen. She realized that if she didn't go out to get Lisa, she would stay here forever. When Sarah was finally able to get up and run after Lisa, she found that the hospital was no longer what it had been. The corridors had become distorted, mazes leading nowhere. Every door led to the same room, and every staircase led downward, deep into this endless prison. With each step, the dark entities squeezed her tighter and tighter, their unspeakable faces flashing through windows, walls, floors. Lisa was already far ahead. She moved strangely, as if she were reaching for another reality, and her body twisted with each step. She didn't look back, but Sarah felt an invisible force pushing her. "Lisa!" Sarah shouted again, but there was only laughter in response. It wasn't her friend's laughter. It was the laughter of all the souls trapped in here. And so Sarah reached the very last door. It was old, dark wood, covered in cracks. She didn't know what was behind it, but one thing was certain. If she opened this door, she would either be free or stay here forever. As Sarah reached out for the doorknob, she felt something cold grab her wrist. It wasn't hands, but something much more creepy, pulling her into a dark abyss. She screamed, but no one came to her aid. The shadows, as if consuming her, were pulling her inside. But at that moment, the door opened on its own. Sarah found herself in a different place. It wasn't a corridor or a ward. It was a place that defied any explanation, a room where there was no time or space. Everything around her was dark and empty. There were old lamps hanging from the ceiling that barely glowed, and old, worn blankets on the floor. But in the center of the room was a table with an old journal on it. Sarah walked over to it and opened the pages. The writing was small, almost illegible, but she could make out a few words. "They won't leave until they've taken everyone." Suddenly, it was clear to her this diary had been written by someone who had been victimized by the hospital. And that someone was still here. But before she could realize what was happening, Sarah felt her feet begin to move on their own. With each step, her feet stomped into the ground and the walls around her shrank, shielding her from the exit. At that moment, she realized that the door she had entered through was gone. She was now part of this place and would never leave it. At that moment, Sarah saw Lisa's face, distorted, staring at her through the cracks in the walls. But Lisa was not alone. Sarah could no longer be sure if she was alive. The question she had been asking herself since the beginning remained unanswered. Will this nightmare ever be over? Sarah felt her mind torn between reality and the nightmare. Her gaze increasingly slid to the dark corners of the room where images moved, almost real, but not quite. Patients' faces, eyes full of pain, hands that reached for her, losing their shape, becoming part of this agony. "You can't leave," one of the voices said. It was familiar. It was the same voice she had heard when she first entered the hospital. She tried to focus, to try to understand what was going on. But all she could manage was to remember Lisa, her eyes full of terror, her last words before she disappeared. "You'll stay here like we all do. We're part of this place. You can't get out." Those words echoed in her head. Sarah felt herself losing her connection to the outside world. She wasn't sure she was really standing in the room anymore. Everything around her was changing, and every movement of her body was slow, as if she was drowning in a liquid, heavy, viscous, and pulling her down. When Sarah opened her eyes again, there were mirrors in front of her, dozens, hundreds, thousands. They were not ordinary mirrors, but dark panes of glass that reflected not her face, but the horrifying, distorted forms that stood before her. They were the same entities, but now they looked at her not as shadows, but as living beings, full of pain, fear, and rage. "You can't escape us," the same voice said again, and Sarah felt her heart race. She was caught in a trap from which there was no escape. But suddenly something changed. In one of the mirrors, she saw Lisa. Lisa stood in the shadows, her face contorted in an agonized expression, but her eyes remained alive. "Lisa!" shouted Sarah, trying to approach the mirror, but her steps were heavy, as if her feet were sinking into something viscous. Lisa didn't answer. Instead, her face in the mirror began to blur and then disappeared, leaving only a dark stain. In that moment, Sarah realized that the mirror was more than just a reflection. It was something more, a link between worlds. The shadows standing around her began to move faster. They clumped together in crowds, forming bizarre but eerie figures. They huddled around her, as if they wanted to swallow her whole. And in this chaos, she saw her Lisa. Lisa stood in the center of the room, but her body was not the same as before. It was not a body, but something alien, distorted and filled with evil. She wasn't alive, but her eyes, full of fear, spoke of what she still felt. "Lisa, what have you done?" shouted Sarah, approaching her. Lisa didn't answer. She just stood there like a shadow, her face continuing to contort. "You can't leave," came the voice again, and Sarah felt her consciousness drifting into darkness. With each step, Sarah sank deeper and deeper into this world of terror. There were no thoughts in her head, only pain and darkness. She tried to wake up again, but she couldn't. Everything around her was monotonous and dark, like a nightmare she was stuck in forever. At that moment, when she was about to give up, she felt something change. The pain was gone and the space began to move as if the hospital itself was breathing, bringing her back to life for a moment. Sarah saw the shadows begin to fade and finally the door reappeared in front of her. She didn't know if this was reality or a new nightmare, but she realized this was her chance. She ran, and with each step she took, the shadows receded, retreating as if they were connected to her fear. When Sarah ran out the door, she found herself back in the very hallway where her story began. But now it was quiet, too quiet. There were no shadows, no whispers, no voices. It felt like everything that had happened was nothing more than a nightmare. She stepped outside the threshold of the hospital and closed the door behind her. But as soon as she was outside, she felt something change. She looked around. The hospital was still in the same place, but now it seemed alive, as if its walls were breathing, reaching out to her. She tried to run away, but her steps were slowing, almost feeling something invisible pulling her back. And that's when she realized this place wouldn't let her go. She could leave Hillside, but Hillside would never let her go. Sarah turned around and took one last look at the hospital. Inside, its windows began to glow dimly, and among the shadows, behind the dark panes, she saw Lisa again. Her face was no longer fearful. It had become calm, as if Lisa had accepted her fate. And when Sarah looked at her one last time, Lisa only whispered softly, "You're going to stay here, like the rest of us." And in that moment, Sarah realized that her soul would forever be a part of this place. Story 2. A shadow in the street of the ancient forest. In a small town in Massachusetts, there was an abandoned mental hospital surrounded by a dense forest called the Forest of Shadows. Locals avoided approaching the place, believing it to be cursed. The history of this hospital was full of horrors, torture, experiments on patients, and mysterious disappearances. But the main tragedy happened many years ago, when there was a fire in the hospital that killed dozens of people. The place has remained empty ever since, but tales of something or someone inhabiting its walls have continued to be passed down from generation to generation. Greta and her husband, Thomas, had recently moved to the township, trying to start a new life. But no matter how hard they tried to avoid the rumors, a vague fear settled in their hearts. Something about the talk of the Forest of Shadows, something in the old men's blank eyes as they passed the hospital, kept them uneasy. One evening, only a few weeks after they had moved in, Greta noticed Thomas standing at the window for a long time, looking out at the old hospital. His face was pale and his eyes were strangely empty. "Are you okay?" she asked. Thomas turned slowly, his face expressing alarm. "I saw something in the hospital window. Someone was standing there in the darkness. But when I looked, that person was gone." Greta, though she felt fear, tried to reassure her husband. "It's just a trick of the light, Tom. Don't think about it. We're here to forget." But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Something was missing in this city. Something dark. A few days later, on a night when the moon was full and red, Thomas and Greta couldn't stand it. Driven by curiosity, they decided to go to the Forest of Shadows. All they had in their hands was a flashlight and a couple of old maps they had found in the local library. The forest, despite its gloomy reputation, looked like an ordinary forest: trees, fallen leaves, but something about its misty silence was special. As soon as they entered the forest, a sense of unease began to build. There was a strange odor in the air, like something rotting. The cracks in the bark of the trees and the strange outlines of their branches gave the illusion that they were moving, watching their every move. Greta stopped suddenly, looking into the dark depths of the forest. For a moment she thought she saw someone's eyes glowing in the darkness. But as soon as she looked there again, the light disappeared. "Did you see that?" she asked, squeezing her husband's hand. Thomas was silent, his eyes wide and his breathing becoming rapid. He was sure it wasn't just imagination. They continued on until they reached the very edge of the forest where the hospital stood. But this time it seemed even more ominous. Even from afar, they could see its windows, smoldered by time, as if watching them. Thomas and Greta approached the hospital and saw that the door was slightly ajar, as if someone was waiting for them. A rush of curiosity compelled them to enter. It was dark inside, but they turned on their flashlights and began to explore the corridors covered in dust and cobwebs. As they passed the ruined chambers, they noticed that in some of the rooms, the walls were painted with strange symbols and old footprints were visible on the floor. However, when they tried to open one of the doors, it would not budge. So they headed for the basement of the hospital, where the most terrifying experiments were said to be hidden. As they descended the creaky stairs, Greta felt a sudden change in temperature. It was even darker downstairs than upstairs. Their flashlights barely illuminated the narrow passage until they reached a large, empty room, in the center of which stood an old table surrounded by chairs and numerous instruments covered in a layer of rust. "What happened here?" Greta whispered, clinging to her husband. Thomas, growing more tense with each step, began looking for clues. He came across old documents, moldy and shabby, that described the horrific procedures performed on the patients. This is impossible," he said, flipping through the pages. "It says here that they were trying to create more than just a cure. They were trying to pull the souls out of people." Suddenly, footsteps came from the corner of the room. Greta and Thomas froze, unable to turn around. The footsteps drew closer, and against their sounds came something more frightening. Whispers. Dark figures began to loom in the darkness, their eyes glittering, and each step felt like a lightning strike. Greta grabbed her husband's hand and they ran up the stairs, toward the exit. But with each step, the shadows grew closer. Invisible hands pulled them back, squeezing their throats and causing them to fall. Finally, they ran outside, but the forest wouldn't let them go. Along the road leading to the house, in every tree they saw the same eyes they had seen in the forest: yellow, cold, full of malice. And in that moment, they realized The Forest of Shadows was alive. He was part of this hospital, part of the cursed place that would not let go of those who dared to enter. Greta and Thomas ran home, but the feeling of persecution would not let them go. The forest whispered its ancient incantations, and the hospital continued to stand in that place, watching. And perhaps, in that moment, they became part of its history, part of its shadow, imprisoned within its walls, forever. Forgotten shadow. After the night Greta and Thomas almost fell victim to the Forest of Shadows, their lives changed forever. They returned home, but neither of them could shake off the strange feeling that they had become part of something much bigger than just a town. The shadows in their home seemed deeper, as if something invisible followed them in every corner. Greta often woke up in the night feeling someone standing at her bedside, but as soon as she turned on the light, everything returned to normal. She tried to ignore the sensations, but every time she passed the window, it seemed for a moment that someone's gaze was watching from behind the fog. Thomas, on the other hand, was different. He became taciturn and often spent nights at the window where he had once seen the figure in the hospital. He said he heard her whispers. He claimed the walls whispered them and the voices came from the forest itself. Greta, I can't forget what we saw. Those shadows. They're behind us. They're waiting for us. One night, as fear and tension reached a fever pitch, Thomas announced that he had to return to the hospital. He was sure that if they didn't go back there, the Forest of Shadows wouldn't let them go. He said there was something left within those walls that they didn't realize, and only by going back could they rid themselves of that curse. Greta tried to talk him out of going, but his decision was firm. He said that if they did not return, the dark forces from the forest would take them away. So, that very night, under the cover of fog and dark clouds, they headed toward the old hospital again. As soon as they reached its gates, the fog grew denser, as if the hospital itself was absorbing the air around it. Greta felt everything around her start to spin again. The walls of the hospital, despite their destruction, stood unwavering, as if they were alive. They entered the hospital through the same door that had been ajar when they first arrived here. But it was different now. Every step echoed in the corridors, and the smell of rot and old age lingered in the air. "We have to find what's hidden here," Thomas said, heading for the basement where they had found the documents last time. Greta could no longer hide her fear. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and she couldn't figure out what it was that she was afraid of. But something told her that they had to go back. The basement was dark and damp, and the air was heavy. When they entered the room where the very table stood, Greta noticed that something was different. On the table was an old, shabby book. It was covered in dust and a layer of moisture, but Greta sensed that it was what they were looking for. Thomas opened the book, and within its pages were records of strange rituals, attempts to extract souls, and the creation of creatures from the shadows. It was all about the experiments the hospital was conducting to peer into the darkest corners of the human soul. It's a curse," Thomas said, reading one of the notes. They were trying to create more than just a cure. They wanted to open a gateway to another dimension, and they did. But something went wrong, and now the shadows from that world come here. As soon as he said those words, Greta felt her body stiffen with terror. Everything around her began to sway, and there was a whisper in the air. Shadows began to appear from dark corners, their faces distorted and their eyes filled with madness. "We shouldn't have come back here," Greta whispered, trying to pull her husband away. But it was too late. They tried to get out, but the hospital had changed. The walls began to move, the corridors grew narrower and narrower, and the doors became unknowable. The shadows weren't just following them anymore. They were becoming part of the place, pulling them into their dark wilds. Thomas and Greta ran through the empty, dark corridors, not knowing where to go. Sometimes they heard footsteps, followed by whispers, as if someone were calling them, beckoning them deeper into the hospital. And at that moment, as Greta and Thomas stood in the center of the labyrinth, the very man they had seen in the mirror when they had first entered this place appeared before them. His face was blurry, distorted, his eyes yellow as fire. "You're here again. It's no accident," he said. Greta and Thomas froze. The man wasn't alive, but he wasn't a shadow either. He was something between worlds. Everything you seek has long been buried here, in the dark corners. You have become part of us, and now you will stay here, forever. At that moment, the hospital began to crumble. Walls cracked, floors crumbled, and shadows consumed the space around them. Greta and Thomas realized they couldn't get out, but as everything around them was swallowed by the fog, they felt their essences being pulled into the vast emptiness where they would forever be a part of this nightmarish reality. And as soon as they were gone, the hospital stood once again in its eerie silence. The forest of shadows swallowed them, as it swallows all who dare to disturb its peace. The shadow in the streets of the ancient forest would forever remain. And if anyone dares to enter this hospital, they too will become part of its dark world. An eternal cycle pulls them into an abyss with no way out. Story 3. The House on Back Street. In one of the forgotten towns in New England, where the locals rarely left their homes after sundown, there was an old house on a street that hadn't been on the maps for a long time. Back Street was what those who didn't dare go there called it. The house was abandoned, but every night its windows glowed dimly, and a strange noise came from its moss-covered roof, as if something was moving inside. Sarah and Jason, a young couple who had moved to town a few weeks ago, didn't believe the local rumors. The back street was just another abandoned part of the old town to them. But with each passing day, their interest in the house grew stronger. Soon they ventured out to explore it, despite the warnings of their neighbors. That evening when they went to the house, the fog hung low, hiding all sounds and turning the street into an empty space. They paced without hearing their own footsteps, and their footsteps seemed muffled, as if everything around them was swallowing them up. The house on Back Street, though dilapidated, didn't look completely abandoned. There was something about its architecture that made it seem alive. As they approached the gate, the door of the house creaked open by itself. The door had obviously not been used in a long time, and even the very creakiness of it in the darkness seemed ominous. "We'd have to wait until morning," Sarah whispered, her voice sounding strained. But Jason, who had always had a thirst for adventure, stepped confidently inside. "It's okay. It's just an old house. We go in, look around, and leave." As they entered, a dark chill came over them. The mold-covered walls glowed faintly with dim patches of light from the old lamps hanging in the corridor. But what was immediately noticeable was the smell. It wasn't just musty. It was as if no living creatures had been here for a long time. But at the same time, there was a strange vibration somewhere inside the house, as if the house was a living, breathing thing. Sarah and Jason began to make their way around the rooms. Everything was dark and deserted. Every room had the same junk in it, old newspapers, furniture covered in dust. But surprisingly, there wasn't a single trace of animals or insects in the house, which was strange for such an abandoned place. Suddenly they heard a sound, a noise that came from the basement. It was something like a rustling, like footsteps, heavy, slow, as if someone or something was moving across the old, rotted floor. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice full of alarm. Jason nodded, and they both stared at the hatch that led to the basement, which was directly in front of them. It was tightly closed, but they both sensed that that was where something important was hiding. They went to the hatch and, after struggling to open it, descended the old wooden stairs, which creaked with each step as if to warn them. The basement was dark, its walls covered with black mold stains, and the air was heavy and damp. Sarah turned on the flashlight, and the beam of light picked out strange footprints from the darkness. They were footprints, they weren't human. These footprints were round, as if something large and heavy had crawled across the floor. "It can't be," Jason said, his voice shaky. They continued to look around the basement until they noticed something strange. There was an old closet in the corner of the basement, apparently untouched for a long time. There was something inside that was not immediately recognizable. The cabinet showed signs of rust, but something inside it continued to glow with a dim, unnatural light. As they got closer, Sarah and Jason saw that inside the cabinet was a door covered with mysterious symbols scratched into the ancient wood. Opening it, they found a small room, dimly lit as if it were illuminated by ghostly lights. In the center of the room was a circle with the same symbols painted on it as on the door. When they crossed the threshold of this room, something strange happened. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Jason felt his hand shake with cold. Sarah looked increasingly worried. "We have to leave," she said, her voice almost indistinguishable in the silence. But just as they turned to leave, the door through which they had entered closed with a rumble. Darkness swallowed everything around them, and their flashlight went out in the same second. Sarah and Jason stood in complete darkness, their hearts beating fast. Suddenly, somewhere in the corner of the room, there was a strange noise. It was footsteps, but they couldn't make out where they were coming from. Simultaneously, the smell of decay appeared in the air, as if there hadn't been any living creatures here for a long time. Out of the shadows, as if moving in unimaginable shadows, figures began to appear. They weren't really people, but rather their distorted reflections, as if the shadows had a life of their own. "What is it?" Sarah whispered, unable to take her eyes off the figure coming toward them. One of the shadows took a step in their direction, and in its eyes there was only coldness, emptiness, and an eerie malice. "We're not leaving here," the figure said, and its voice was low, muffled, as if it came from the shadows themselves. Sarah and Jason tried to run, but the room was changing. The walls were curving and the door was disappearing. It was as if time had slowed down and they were trapped. The shadows surrounded them, slowly tightening the circle. The more they tried to resist, the more their strength faded. And at the last moment, before the darkness swallowed them, Sarah remembered a strange dream she'd had a few nights ago. It hadn't been a dream. It was a prophecy. They couldn't get out because they themselves had become part of this house. The gates were open and they were trapped inside like all those who had tried to enter this cursed corner of the world. This story is complete. If you want to continue or change details, let me know. Several months have passed, and the town seems to have forgotten about the terrible incident that happened in the house on Back Street. However, those who survived could not shake off the feeling that something still lurked in that place. Whispers reminiscent of old memories haunted them. Greta, who had returned here after Sarah and Jason disappeared, felt her heart clench as if she herself had become a part of this place. She had been one of the few who had dared to walk down Back Street, hoping to find answers to the questions that had plagued her ever since. Though rumors of the house had died down, all the locals knew that its influence was far from destroyed. Only those who had tried to fight it had left. Those who remained now avoided the place, for the shadows grew stronger every day. Greta, on the other hand, could find no peace. She was worried about her sister, whose disappearance had left a void in her soul. When she came to town, Greta often asked the old men about the events at the house, but they only turned away silently, as if they were trying to forget what had happened. But Greta knew that the answers had to be found there in the heart of evil, in the house on Back Street. As soon as Greta approached the house, a strange chill swept over her and the fog surrounded her again. Everything was just as she remembered, but something new hung in the air. Not just fear, but a real sense that something ancient, powerful, and utterly alien was actually present here. The door of the house stood ajar as it had before, the feeling that it was waiting for her haunted Greta at every turn. Stepping inside, she felt heavy, as if the air was saturated with a curse. The floors creaked beneath her footsteps, the walls seemed to whisper, and somewhere far below, a quiet but insistent sound could be heard, as if someone was dragging someone across the floor. Greta felt her breathing become rapid. At the same second, she noticed something moving in the darkness in one of the rooms. It was something strange, a blob of shadow that seemed to sense her presence. She stepped closer, and then, as her fingers almost touched the door, she heard footsteps behind her. Without turning around, Greta took a few steps back and saw a figure emerge from the darkness of the room. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't a shadow either. It was something in between, something that existed on the edge of reality and illusion. The figure came closer, and Greta felt her heart clench. At that moment, the figure spoke. "You know why you came. The answers are always here, in this place." but you cannot understand them until you become part of us." Greta froze. It was the same thing the figure had said to Jason and Sarah, but now she felt the words begin to consume her as if they were her own. Just as Greta was about to turn and leave, the door behind her closed with a rumble. The whole room had become a veritable trap. The shadows that had been mere figures before now began to move, coming toward her. There was a grin in every shadow, something sinister in every movement. "You will not leave," the figure whispered in her direction. And in that moment, as if reality itself was beginning to crumble, Greta realized they were right. This house was more than just a place. It was a gateway through which not only shadows passed, but all those who dared to seek answers. Her footsteps slowed and the room began to spin around her. The shadows in the walls began to absorb the light, and she felt her body shrink. She was no longer just a person. She had become part of that very house, part of the curse that pulled her like everyone before her. Images began to surface in her mind. Images of the people who had disappeared in that house. Their faces were contorted in misery, their voices full of pain, but they couldn't leave. They were all here, forever, part of this evil world created by the curse. In that moment, Greta realized that she would never be able to leave this place. She had become part of the shadows that would now move through the corridors, searching for new souls to join them in this eternal hell. Time had lost all meaning. Greta was no longer human. She had become one of the very shadows that haunted anyone who dared to disturb the peace of the house on Back Street. And so now every newcomer to this place, whether a resident of the town or a traveler, always felt that they were not alone. The shadows whispered their names, calling to them, and in every step sounded the warning, "He who enters will never leave." And so, in eternity, the house stood its ground, and those who dared to look inside were gone forever. They became part of the curse, part of this terrible circle where there was no way out.